which we still use every day for the hardwood tree trunk laid across a stream for passage. And we have the everyday words hammock or canoe and so on, but of particular interest to me was the way that echoes of the ancient, generic, indigenous myths and customs of South America suddenly reappear in Guyanese literature. And I want to take Mittelholzer's novel, My Bones and My Flute. Now, throughout South America, there are indigenous folk tales and customs concerning the flute. For instance, there is a Warao narrative in which a woman plays a bamboo flute as a magical protection against a tiger, who later turns into a man. And of more interest is the bone flute. Now, bone flutes are amongst the earliest deliberately made musical instruments known to man. Some are made from animal bones. Arawak legends point to the spirits of the forest as introducers amongst them of the flute made from the femoral bone of animals. The flute provides a link with both the animals and the spirits of the forests. In one Arawak story, a husband has been killed in a massacre, and the wife is at home waiting for him. And she's very pleased because she thinks he's still alive, as she hears the sound of a flute approaching the house, coming nearer and nearer. She thinks he survived the massacre, but he has indeed died, and the sound of the flute is just his spirit trying to get home. There are stories of the Makushi and Warao, which include the flute as a particular magical force in certain rituals. They'd be played to dispel evil spirits. The Caribs made human bone flutes from their enemies' bones, thinking they could communicate with their enemies and learn what they were thinking. And George Mentor, in a previous Mittelholzer lecture, talked of the Wai-Wai flute, known amongst the Wai-Wai as the transporter of mystical death. Now, Mittelholzer's novel, My Bones and My Flute, is based on the real history of the 18th century Berbice slave uprising and concerns the Guyanese Jumbi figure of Dutchman, who haunts those who disturb his grave or do not give his bones proper burial. Now, the original folk tale about Dutchman does not traditionally involve a flute. If you hear grassroots people talking about what they remember or know about that myth, they will talk about the Dutchman patrolling the boundaries of his plantation. They will talk about the fact that he needs to be given proper burial. Sometimes they talk about buried treasure, but they do not mention the flute. But from nowhere in Mittelholzer's novel, the flute motif appears to terrifying effect. It is the most hair-raising and powerful element of the book. Mittelholzer has combined a folk figure from the colonial period, the Dutchman, with one of the most ancient, truly South American indigenous elements of myth and ritual. Characters in the book hear a flute playing. It comes closer and closer, as is similar in the old Arawak story, and finally it drags them to their death in the river, leaving the brand of a flute mark on the body. Now, some critics, have said that Mittelholzer, who was a Europhile, took this element of his story from Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. But that opera is light-hearted, satirical, has none of the horror that infuses the novel. Mittelholzer's flute retains a ghastly power. Now, it's too late to discover how he heard about the flute. Maybe it was somebody who helped raise him, who told him the story. Maybe it was just that vague intuition that sometimes works on an author's imagination. Who knows the mysterious pathways by which these ancient stories are spread and through what means they infiltrate our literature. But this reappearance of the flute in Guyanese literature is interesting. Wilson Harris, one of the great Guyanese novelists, one of the few novelists to have spent time in the interior, refers repeatedly to the Makushi bone flute. And he also refers to a mythical bone flute bridge that stretches from the Mayan civilizations of Central America to the Guyana highlands. In essays, he states his belief that Guyana is contained in a fragile host consciousness, barely discernible, which is Amerindian, and thus profoundly South American. His essay, The Schizophrenic Sea, talks of the bone flute as a confessional organ, and traces of the bone flute occur in his novel The Sleepers of Roraima and in the prologue to the Guyana Quartet. The faint echo of the flute also appears quite unexpectedly in the work of Guyanese poet Mahadai Das. She left Guyana, she was living in Chicago, when she produced a volume of poetry entitled Bones. In one poem called Flute, she says, and I quote, "My body's a hallowed stick of bone, a flute through which you pipe your melody." In a different cross-cultural parallel, Wilson Harris introduces the Amerindian figure of Kanaima, an enigmatic, tricksterish figure of revenge. It appears in his novel, The Four Banks of the Rivers of Space. And there's another important aspect of Harris's work that shows influences from Central and South America that sometimes make his work challenging to readers. It is his way of dealing with time and space. Writings from the ancient Mayan civilization of Central America reveal a notion of time and space entirely different from traditional Western thought. The past and the future merge together and are not necessarily differentiated. Harris acknowledges these influences, and he plays with chronology in a way that can prove difficult for his readers because people are more introduced to a linear sense of time. But a linguist, Benjamin Lee Whorf, in his book Language, Thought and Reality, analyzes the relationships of the Hopi, North American indigenous Indian, and relates his studies to the language of the Mayan Indians. And he found that the structure of these languages was better suited to certain scientific concepts than the English language. And those concepts include differing concepts of time and space, making the languages structurally more in tune with Einstein's theory of relativity. And hints of these differences are found in the work of Wilson Harris, and it is a reminder to us to study and to preserve the Amerindian languages in Guyana. Well, it's through these influences, faint echoes or shadows, that we can place Guyanese literature in a South American context, distinguishing it from the rest of the Anglophone Caribbean's island literature. But I want to make one important point. There are many children's versions of these stories, folk stories. Amelavaka by Yankaru is one, and they're often delightful and frightening, as children's stories should be. However, I personally feel it's a great mistake to infantilize this literature as if it were only suitable for children and should be confined to children. When used in adult literature, as with Harris, Mittelholzer, or from Brazil, Mario de Andrade or Darcy Ribeiro, such influences hold an undeniable power, just as there is power to be gained from ancient Homeric myths in the works of James Joyce's Ulysses. These are to business. Eduardo Galeano from Uruguay criticizes this reductionist attitude, this tendency to infantilize local literature and creativity throughout South America. In a passage from his book, The Nobodies, Galeano says, "The nobodies, the no ones, who don't speak languages but dialects, who don't have religions but superstitions, who don't create art but handicrafts, who don't have culture but folklore, who are not human beings but human resources. It is time to stop demeaning them." Now, the second part of my lecture is going to look at magic realism. Magic realism was the major literary movement that had its genesis in Latin America in the second half of the 20th century. And it's very important to define this genre clearly, because people think that it's magic realism, it must be about fantasy or superstition, and that's not actually the case. The term magic realism comes from the original Spanish phrase, lo real maravilloso, and the correct translation is the marvels of reality. And significantly, the first person to have developed a theory of lo real maravilloso in this hemisphere was the Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier. Well, he's known as Cuban, but he was in fact born in Switzerland of Russian and French parentage, but he was raised in Cuba, and this is a fluid region that will absorb what it likes and rejects what it does not like, without too particular a regard for bureaucratic classifications. Similarly, our Guyanese poet Ian MacDonald was born outside Guyana, parentage from elsewhere, but he spent much of his life here, and we like him, so he claims us and we claim him. So the boundaries have become fluid. Guyana, of course, has its own extraordinary. We actually live daily a life of magic realism. Guyana hangs in a sort of limbo. It is South American, while, thank you. It's South American, but not part of Latin America. It's Caribbean, but not one of the islands. It's a country with shifting, floating, ever-changing cultural base, difficult to pin down.